Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Darren Taylor, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the law of vibration. Now, unlike last video, we're going to be touching on a few different topics, and some very interesting topics that I'd love to talk about. So, we're going to be covering not only the law of vibration itself, but a little bit of physics, a little bit of pattern recognition, reincarnation, and identity. So, some very solid topics for us to discuss in this video. So without any further ado, let's jump straight into it. In the Kabbalion, it says nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. And this is in reference to the law of vibration. Now, the law of vibration is actually the third Hermetic principle. We have skipped one. We've skipped the law of correspondence, which we're going to be covering in the next video. And the reason that we're skipping it is because I've always found that it's easier to talk about mentalism, vibration, and then correspondence, rather than doing them in the original way, because this allows for a much deeper perspective, I find, when trying to explain them all in pretty quick succession. So what is the law of vibration? Well, it essentially means that everything is energy, just on a very basic level. Everything is energy, energy vibrates, the universe is simply vibratory energy vibrating at a particular frequency. So this law embodies the concept that there's no such thing as rest, as dead or non-motion, and that everything is constantly in motion. There is no such thing as true or absolute rest. And if such a thing is in existence, then it is in motion. Nowhere in the universe does there exist something that is at complete rest. At the most fundamental level, the universe and everything which comprises it, including people, thoughts, words, emotions, at its very core is pure vibratory energy manifesting itself in different ways. And this includes things that we can see in front of us and things that we can't see. To quote one of my favorite philosophers, the first principle of the universe are atoms and empty space. The atoms are unlimited in size and number, and they are born along the whole universe in a vortex, and thereby generate all comprising things, fire, water, air, and earth, for even those conglomerations of given atoms. So to put it very simply, the universe is made of energy, and this is something that in science we all know very well, very easily. Everything is comprised of atoms, particles, molecules, which are all just vibratory energy that are vibrating at a particular frequency. And so what does that tell us about the universe? Well, at its basic form, the universe is made of the same building blocks. Every single thing that you see, hear, touch, taste, interact with is made of the same building blocks, energy. It is the universal cement, or the glue that holds the entire universe together. And not just with physical things, but with everything that goes on in our minds. You could even argue, and I've seen some magicians argue, that consciousness itself is energy. So, well, what does this tell us about magic? Well, all magic is simply the manipulation of energy. This is a much more simpler way to understand what energy work is. And I think that energy work tends to be very often misunderstood. There's a lot of misconceptions about it, and we're going to touch on that in this video. All magic is simply the manipulation of energy, psychologically, to achieve certain results. You are simply changing the frequencies in which certain energy is vibrating at. Very simple to understand, not that complicated. Now, to refer back to my previous video where I said that all magic is psychological and scientific in nature, I'm also going to say that not only is all magic energy work, but all of life is technically energy work. We are all using and manipulating and changing energy throughout our day-to-day life. So this process is no different than what we're doing in a magical process. Again, logically showing you the similarity between magic and mundane life. There is no degrees of separation here. They are exactly the same thing in process and principle. So now we're going to touch on our first big misconceptions. One of the things that I find to be one of the most irritating things that I find in our community, and that is the concept of raising energy. Now, what do I mean by raising energy? We've all heard several spiritual or occult practitioners in ritual or meditation or whatever talking about how they're going to raise energy. Well, what exactly is raising energy? When I observe what people do when they're raising energy, they're sitting there and visualizing energy raising up from the ground or wherever it is they think it's coming from. But what does it actually do? Because with these methods that a lot of people talk about in raising energy, they're not actually doing very much, because it implies that this raising energy is separate from physical reality. Now, of course, we can do the whole debate about what is physical and what is not, and the law of vibration is a great topic to have that debate on. You could argue that since everything is made up of the same building blocks, that the spiritual and the physical are exactly the same thing, that physical reality is in fact an illusion. And there are many, many theories about this, some of which we'll go into more depth in a later video. But for this video, we're going to just touch on one of the biggest misconceptions. There is no difference between the spiritual realm, or the spiritual side of life, and the physical. They are exactly the same thing. There are no degrees of separation. They are all made of the same building blocks and operate within the same space. And so when I hear people talk about raising energy, well, technically speaking, eating an apple is raising energy because you're literally consuming energy which fuels your physical body. So sitting and just thinking about raising energy isn't as effective as doing something that will physically make a difference, things that you will physically and tangibly feel. And that is one of the biggest problems that I find with spiritual practices. Not all of them, but some of them. As that they attempt to do things in what I would call a spiritual way, which is where there's not really much physical going on, but an understanding that there are no degrees of separation between them both. You can think, well, you could just go and do the physical version of that and have it much more effective. Why sit and think about giving yourself more energy when you could consume something that will actually give you more energy, something that you can actually feel? Because that's what they're attempting to do in these rituals and these spells. You're attempting to have some form of feeling that you can then lend to that ritual. And so what is better than having something you can physically feel? And this comes from that misconception that the spiritual and the physical are separate. No, they're the same exact thing. And when we go into the law of correspondence in the next video, this will become even more clear. Because it's all just the same thing. It's all energy. It's all made from the same building blocks. Now, what does physics tell us about energy? The first rule of physics, or at least the first rule that I was taught in physics, is that energy cannot be created, and therefore it cannot be destroyed. It can only be altered. It can only be changed. Energy can be manipulated. It can be altered. It can be changed, etc., etc. But it cannot be created or destroyed. Now, we're not going to go into the hows or the whys in that. But this does give us something to work with in magic. That essentially every single thing that we do in mundane life and in our rituals is attempting to take more of a control over the altering of said energy. And so really, when you break down in the most basic of scientific ways what you're trying to do in a ritual, you're essentially trying to alter certain energies that are going on in yourself, in your environment, and have that complement a goal or result that you're willing to achieve. And so really, that's what your mind is doing. Your mind is attempting to alter physical energy in your environment, in your own internal space, and have that create results. Because all of it's energy. Now, there's this topic that I talk about in one of my previous books called vibrational magnetism. And this is another rule with energy, that like attracts like. Two different vibrations that are the same in likeness will naturally be pulled together. And so when you think about this in terms of mentalism, and you think about this in terms of magic, magic is the attempt of vibrational magnetism. You are trying to emit a frequency or a vibration that will then sync with other vibrations to then pull things together. So if you're vibrating a frequency of richness and money, you're going to pull those things to you. And this is where the concept of law of attraction really comes into effect. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail because, again, there's more videos to come on that. But essentially, that's what a ritual is. It's an attempt at vibrational magnetism. And this is why things like the state of mind And putting out the right frequency, as cliche as it sounds, is very, very important, because you're attempting to sync your current state with the things that you want to achieve. And this is why the law of mentalism is so important. If you go into a ritual with a contradictory thought or with something that you don't want, you are still going to pull it to you. Very, very simple, not too complicated to grasp. But now that bears another question. If energy cannot be created or destroyed, only altered, what does that mean for life? Because that suggests that reincarnation is indeed possible. And I would have to agree with this. This principle alone suggests that at least some aspects of reincarnation are not only possible, but are in some way logically proven through this principle. Our bodies, which are made of physical energy, can't be created or destroyed, only altered. And so when the body breaks down after death, that energy continues to move on to something else. You could say with somewhat of a certainty that reincarnation is viable. However, the topic that I think gets reincarnation into trouble is identity. Identity is the one thing you could debate that doesn't move on with reincarnation, which is why so few people, apart from the few extreme cases, which, again, it's impossible to say, some certain phenomenon might be possible, but there's very little evidence to support that identity carries on after death. So this comes into what I call pattern recognition, and that is simply being able to observe patterns within anything, or in this case, the universe. So when you look at things like the golden ratio, and you look at how those patterns continue through different stages and different sizes, almost in the sense of like a hologram. So if you take a hologram and split it in two, you don't get two halves of the whole, you get two half-sized portions of the whole thing. Both of them contain the whole. This is where the theory of the holographic universe kind of comes in a little bit with the law of vibration. But pattern recognition is being able to simply recognize patterns. And there's a scientific principle that if you can spot a continuing pattern going one direction, it is most likely to go in the other. So I'm going to ask just a very basic question, and this is going to tie into our theory on identity. Are we an individual? Are you an individual? Is what we would consider an individual an actual individual? Now I want you to take a second to actually contemplate that question. Are you an individual? Most people would answer, well, yes, I'm an individual. And a lot of that is linked to identity. They think that their identity is part of what makes them an individual. But what is it that our minds are made of? Now bear in mind that our identity is linked to several parts of our brain. And that brain is made up of millions and billions of single-celled organisms, which each have an intelligent mind. Now, okay, their minds are definitely not as sophisticated as our own, but they do have a nucleus. They do have some form of mind that allows them to carry out basic functions as a single-celled organism. So are we an individual or are we a collective? Are we a single individual, or are we simply a collective unit of millions and billions of single-celled organisms? Technically speaking, you could say that we're even a community of single-celled organisms. When you shift your perspective on that, you start to learn a little bit more about your own identity, that, well, actually your identity is dependent upon many different things of which you have no control over whatsoever. Many different things that are in and of themselves individual units. At the very most, you could say that we are an individual made of other individuals. Gets a little bit complicated there. And then try and look the other way. Well, what happens when you put a ton of people together? Just like a load of single-celled organisms can make a multi-celled organism. What happens when you put a lot of multi-celled organisms together? Do we then create another mind? I would argue that we do. This thing that we have called society, which is almost, in a sense, like a collective mind that is in itself very sophisticated. When you consider a lot of those questions, you start to realize how subjective a lot of these things, such as identity, actually are. And that really, we are somewhat of a small piece to play in all of this. But what does that tell us about our identity? Well, what happens when we die and those cells die? What happens to the energy? Because our brain, that which stores our identity, our characteristics, our subconscious programming, ceases to be. It breaks down, dies, and the energy will then move on to something else. But the energy itself doesn't carry the identity because it changes, it alters. And so it is our theory that when we die, we do not retain our identity. And this is why I think that humans have a tendency to want to leave a legacy behind, is because somewhere on an unconscious level, we understand that our identity doesn't actually live on. It is only our memory and our name that lives on. Our actual identity, in terms of at least our consciousness, goes back to just this raw form of energy, or shifts into another frequency, another vibration, in which it's not tied to what it was before. A lot of things to consider. But the most important part of this principle is to understand that everything is energy. Everything is made of the same thing, and energy is constantly around us. And we can tap into that at any point because we are part of it. We exist within it. And so all magic is simply the use of certain frequencies, certain vibrations in a specific setting in order to attain certain results. And this is why frequency in magic is so important. This is why your mindset is so important. Because every time you have a thought, you are projecting the literal vibration frequency, almost like a signal, out into your environment. What you think about, you bring about. And this is how the law of mentalism and the law of vibration ties in together. If you look at psychology, you will often find that people who are very angry end up finding themselves around angry people. We tend to surround ourselves with people who are like us, rather than people who are completely different, because we vibrate on a certain level, and we bring those things to us. Now you take that in terms of magic. If you start vibrating a frequency of things that you don't have, you'll start to see them come towards you. Now again, this is basic law of attraction. I don't tend to follow everything that the law of attraction, or at least most people who believe in the law of attraction, stand by. I think that it's more of a limited version of the law of vibration. It gets a lot more complicated, but simply put, what you think about, what you vibrate, what the signal that you're putting out vibrationally is what is going to come back to you. What you think about, you bring about. Where energy goes, energy flows. And that is where we're going to leave it for this week. I know this might have been a lot of information to take in. We've covered identity, we've covered reincarnation. There's a lot of different topics that are linked to the law of vibration, but one of the things that I love about it is that this principle will tie into every single principle that we cover after this. So I know this one was a little bit more scattered than my usual videos, but that's because this bleeds into a lot of other things. This principle is somewhat like the glue that holds all of it together. So I want to thank you all for listening. This has been a slightly longer video than usual. If you like this video, I'll ask that you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And we appreciate all the support. And until next time, stay awesome.